Hello, everyone. This is the end of the EU transition period. What does this mean for London Business webinar? This is a take two of the webinar that we recorded live on the 9th of December 2020. It has all the same material, but we had some technical problems with that. Sound quality wasn't there. People couldn't hear me. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But anyway, if you do want to hear me, what I was talking about in that webinar, here we go again. So what does the end of the transition period mean for London business? Well, first of all, first slide, Brexit is coming. Little summary of where we are. I won't be too detailed, but the end of the Brexit transition period is coming on the 31st of December 2020, and it's going to affect you and your business. It's up to you to take action now to prepare for it if you haven't already. And if you look at the government website and all the government promotional campaign that have been the adverts on the TV, that sort of thing, it's almost very clear that it's on you to deal with it as a business owner. So that's fairly clear and fairly explicit. What about if there's a deal? Love to talk about a deal for quite some considerable period of time. Are you sitting thinking, well, if there'll be a deal at the last minute, so I don't need to bother? Well, unfortunately not. Whether there is a deal or not a deal, no deal, there will still be big changes to the business. Now, on that point, some of the changes that are going to come in, and those are mainly in this section that I'm re-recording, that I presented on the 9th of December. Most of the material and the information in my webinar, as opposed to the other speaker's webinar, is not going to change depending on whether there is a deal or not a deal, as particularly the immigration parts of it, as we'll come on to. So those things, a lot of these things are going to happen anyway. How can you find out about this in more detail? There's a lot to get through in half an hour. There's a lot just on the topics I'm covering. The London Business Hub has a free set of guides that explain what's happening, and it gives you a quick checklist of things you need to know and do. In there, at the back of it, in amongst the material, there is, or at least there should be, a glossary of terms explaining the meaning of the various phrases and abbreviations. It's almost like a whole new Brexit language that we have to learn. And there are things in there like how you can get hold of what countries are in the EU or in the EEA or in EFTA and all the various other organisations. I'm not going to list those all in this webinar. You'll be delighted to hear. But if you go into those guides, if you need to know those things, there's a glossary in there you can get hold of in a table form. It's quite low tech. It's just an old style table you can print out and look at, for particularly for people like me who aren't maybe so technically savvy as others. There is also in there the reference chart, easy reference chart, or Brexit toolkit, which is about 3 or 4 pages in the form of a table, and it has quick links to specific questions you might have. So if you wanted to know what, say, an EU blue card was, that will tell you, and it will have a link to that. Or if you wanted to know what the particular rules on employment law and that sort of thing, then you can find that all in there. They're in alphabetical order. There's a general one at the top you can click on for a general overview, and all the others break it down in alphabetical order. If you can't find that on there, how do you get hold of it? Give me a call. I'd be delighted to send it to you if you can't get hold of it anywhere else, if you're getting a bit desperate, pulling your hair out. So next slide is the brief guide to Brexit for businesses. This is the webinar, what we're talking about. The webinar will cover 4 vital areas where businesses must take action. First of all, there is employment, and that has got 2 sides to it. Employing EU nationals in the UK, and the flip side, employing UK nationals at your European or EU office. Second part, which was dealt with by my co-speaker, is trading legally with the EU, complying with EU and UK regulation, managing changes to tax and tariffs. That's not going to be in this re-recording. You can go to the original for that. By the time that came on, we managed to sort out the technical issues, so the sound quality on that, I'm told, is superb. The presentation is also superb, I might add. So that is my co-speaker's section on trade. You might want to check that out. I'm sure the links will be put up here on the end of the webinar. Intellectual property or IP and EU data. This is me again. data transfers, websites, domain names, technology providers, copyright, patents and trademarks. And finally, travelling to and from the EU. On the day that I'm doing this pre-recording, due to the coronavirus crisis, nobody's travelling anywhere, but never mind. I'm sure that will be resolved in the fullness of time, and I'll deal with that. There's an overlap between that and immigration, as you'll see. So, next stage, I am, as hopefully you will have seen from the website material and adverts, I'm a lawyer, I'm a solicitor. My name's Michael Large, and as a lawyer, I'm giving the disclaimers. So this is the disclaimer slide. Be very aware that the GLA's guides in this webinar are for general information only. They're not a substitute for specific legal or other advice. So where necessary, you should seek advice from a suitably qualified professional or contact the relevant regulator or government body. And without wishing to plug the Brexit toolkit, the checklist too much, you can. Where would you look for that? Well, that would be a good place to start. I would suggest get hold of that and start looking through that to see where you can get that advice from. The GLA cannot, and neither can I for that matter, cannot accept any liability arising from any action or failure to act on the basis of the information in these guides or this webinar. So this is general information only. And if there is a deal before 31st December 2020, and I've already mentioned this, it may differ from the content of these guides in this webinar, so it might change. At the time of writing, the transition period ends on 31st December, and the changes outlined in the fact sheet will occur from the 1st of January 2021, New Year's Day onwards. If the date slips, the changes will still happen, but at a later date. But there doesn't seem to be any indication at the moment that that date is going to slip or be extended. And as I mentioned, a lot of the changes in my webinar aren't going to change anyway, having said all that. So the next slide, employment. Here's the first section, and it's probably the one that is going to affect most people day to day who are listening to this webinar. Key points to remember. The UK has made changes to its immigration rules, and these will start on 31st December 2020. So they will happen come what may, whether there is a deal or not, and if there is a deal, regardless of what is in it. Similarly, the rules on travel to and from the UK and the EU are going to change when travel is allowed again, and that is the final section of my talk. Free movement with the EU will end on 31st December 2021. I think most people aren't old enough to remember the time before free movement with the EU, but that is coming to an end. So it's a major change, a big departure from what's been going on for many years. What won't change? UK employment law, which is to a great extent based on EU law. That will not change after the transition period ends. So all the stuff you know and love about employment law and employment tribunals and all the rest of it, that's going to stay the same on New Year's Day. So we can breathe a sigh of relief there anyway. That's all going to be the same. However, it may change in the future, potentially. It's not necessarily going to be like that for all time. If you're an EU national and a business owner in the UK, and this is something you really bear in mind, the immigration rules will also affect you. Just because you're a business owner, maybe it's common sense, maybe not, maybe it's easy to overlook, I don't know, but I'm pointed out anyway. The immigration rules will affect you whether you own a business or you work in somebody else's business. So next slide, employing EU nationals in the UK, checklist. Who is affected? Well, I've been talking about big changes and big upheavals and this, that, and the other. Irish citizens are not affected, and they can continue to live, work, and study in the UK without any change whatsoever. EU and EEA, that's the European Economic Area, which you can, if you go to the guides and the Brexit guides and the checklist, you can find a list of all those countries. I'm not going to go through them all now, you'll be relieved here. European Economic Area and Swiss nationals and their families will be affected. If they are living in the UK if they live in the UK before 31st December, before the end of this month, 2020, they can and should apply for the EU settlement scheme if they haven't already. and this must be done by the 30th of June 2020, says on the slide, 2021, I beg your pardon. It says on the slide the 202, which is my typographical error, but it's quite clear, you'll see from the next point, until 30th June 2021 refers to that. So if you're living in the UK and you are not an Irish citizen, if you're EU or EEA or Swiss national, then you need to get onto the EU settlement scheme right away. If you haven't, you've got until 30th June, but I would say rush out and do that as soon as you can, or go online and do that rather. Valid passport or ID card until 30th June anyway, should be enough to prove that you have the right to work if you're from one of those countries, if you're affected. There is a government online checking system, so while I say passport and ID or ID card should be enough, do check. And right to work checks will need to be carried out after the 30th June next year, 2021, on EU and EEA and Swiss nationals. So employers will have to check that their employees have the right to work. Consider the sponsorship process for employees with no automatic right to work. So there is that potentially if employees don't have the right to work. And the new points-based immigration system, which has had a lot of publicity and press, will apply after 1st January 2021. You can see exactly how that works and how you can get the points, how the points will clock up in the Brexit guides that are available online from the GLA, and you can also find it out elsewhere. It's a little bit long and unwieldy to go through all of it right now, but you can get hold of it on there and look at that. Do expect increased costs from visas, from right to work checks, and from other taxes from the 1st January 2021. So the costs of that are going to go up. Next slide. The flip side of this, what about if you've got an office in London, say, it's your head office, and you've got an EU office in, I don't know, Strasbourg or Brussels or Paris or Berlin or wherever it may be, and you are employing UK nationals in that office out in Strasbourg or Berlin or Brussels or wherever. If you work in the EU, or if you yourself do that for that matter, if you work in the EU, EEA or Switzerland, or have workers in those countries, there may be visa costs for, and there probably will be, British citizens travelling within the EEA and Switzerland from 1st January 2021. That's, I am assuming and very much hoping we will be allowed to travel again at that point. I'm sure we will, but there will be visa costs. Employees who are UK nationals should consider residence schemes in their country of residence. And new employees who are UK nationals who are travelling to the EU after the 31st December this year, 2020, will be considered third country nationals. And that means they will need the correct permits to enter, to stay, and to work. And there have been a lot of stories in the press about people going from the UK on 24-hour visits to carry out, for instance, contract work, repairs to machinery, all that sort of thing, and that they will be potentially subject to very steep fines if they don't have the correct paperwork when they do that. That's a little bit outside the remit of this webinar. It's a little bit too detailed. There's some of this is inevitably scare stories, but there is probably some truth in it as well, that if you don't have the right to work in the country and you go there and do work, then presumably it's illegal, and presumably you are going to be leaving yourself or your employees open to being fined. So you do need to watch out for that, quite simply. So check if your employee also needs to start paying social security contributions in that country, which will be part and parcel of working there. And workers may need to exchange their UK driving license for a local or international license. One other thing to watch out for is, let's say you've got an EU, EA or Swiss national employed in your London office, and there's some, I don't know, they get promoted or whatever, and they're going to go out to work in your Brussels office to do whatever they're going to do there. That might affect their status under the EU settlement scheme, so they might go out and find that they can't come back when they get promoted. I don't know, you promote them again or something, and then they come back to London. So you need to watch out for that. This, again, is really quite involved, and it's difficult for me to give too much specific guidance on it because cases do differ. You can get hold of all the specific information on that point through the Brexit checklist. You can look in that. You can find the specifics from the Home Office and everything else. So do look at that. And I would say it's very difficult for me to offer specific guidance on when or whether that is okay, other than to say look out for it, because it is a problem and it is likely to continue to be a problem. So that's employment law. We'll move on to the next slide, which is intellectual property, or IP for short, and EU data. The background to this: the UK will be outside the single market for data transfers and digital services after 31st December 2020. It will be outside the single market for everything. So, of course, it's going to be outside the single market for that too. This is crucial. Almost all businesses now handle data in some form or another, even if it's lists of email addresses for customers. There is very, very few businesses. I can't really think of any businesses that don't handle data in some form or another, even if it's just the most basic thing as a mailing list. Pretty much everybody's got. Even if your main business isn't in digital services, you can assume that you will be affected. Those rules on data aren't going to go away. They are just going to disappear on the 1st of January, and we can have a free-for-all and do whatever we like, but they are going to change. As I said, data is crucial to modern-day business, and you may well need specialist advice about it. But I can flag up the main areas to think about, and you can get a lot more guidance, again, from the Brexit handouts on the London Business Hub, and from I would also recommend you look at the checklist and the toolbox that are in there, because you can get to a lot of the crucial links and the crucial information you need that way relatively quickly. The main areas to worry about are data transfers, to deal with, shall we say, rather than worry about, are data transfers. Secondly, websites, domain names and technology providers. And thirdly, more generic intellectual property, IP rights like copyright and that sort of thing. So moving on to the next slide, data transfers checklist. Check your data flow and transfer mechanisms, your standard contractual clauses, and any binding corporate rules you use, and your privacy policy. You can check this with the, how do you do that? It's a good question. It's easy for me to say, oh, check it. Well, I can tell you, you can check with the Information Commission Office, the ICO, and the European Data Protection Board, and all their contact details and their websites are all in the Brexit toolkit that you can get hold of. As I've mentioned a few times, at risk of repeating myself, they're all on there. You can click straight into it, get on there, and find out what you need to do from them directly. If you do receive or process any personal data from customers, which might just be their address, their internet address, or their home address, or whatever, from customers or suppliers or contacts in the European Economic Area, so not just the EU, but the EEA, the Information Commission Office has an interactive tool to tell you what you need to do. So you can go onto that, say what your the data is, say who the suppliers are and where they are, and then you can work out what you've got to do from that. Check the consent you have from anyone you collected data from. You probably remember that a few years ago, all the stuff about what's still going on, because getting consent from anyone you've got data on, you hold data on. And we don't know yet, unfortunately, if consent obtained that you have now when the UK was in the EU, well, forgive me, the UK isn't in the EU, but what we don't know is if consent obtained when it was in the EU will still be valid when you're dealing with the EU in the future after the transition period. And we might add to that, similarly, we don't know if consent obtained during the transition period is either, for that matter. So the safest thing to do is probably, frankly, to assume that it isn't, and to go about taking further steps to get new consent afterwards, after the end of the transition period. And that's the safest course, but we just simply don't know the answer to that. So I can tell you it's strange, I can tell you I don't know the answer, but I can advise you what to do. That's a slightly strange one for you, but there we go. You may need an EU representative, or if you have you may need to have an office in an EU or an EA country if you want to receive or process data from customers, suppliers, or contacts in the EU. How do you get hold of those? Well, clearly, in the GLA, we can't recommend any specific representatives to you. I can't say I use so-and-so, he's great. but there are lots of them online, and you really need to start making so quite easy to get hold of, actually, to find them. I was able to do it very, very swiftly, and you'll be able to find someone there and compare them, and I suppose, and see who you'd like to make some inquiries, who you'd like to use. If you have offices in other EU states as well, you must nominate an EU regulator and not the ICO, the Information Commission Office, which is UK based. So your EU data traffic, or indeed EA data traffic, is going to have to be with an EU regulator. Again, how do you nominate them? You can find out on the toolkit. Next slide, please. Intellectual property, IP, and EU data. So websites, domain names, and technology providers. Here's a short checklist. What to do. If you use any websites or other tech services that are hosted in the EU, then you need to check whether their services or your contract with them will be affected by the end of the transition period. If you hold any registered EU web domain names, eu.com or whatever, then you need to check the government guidance and see if you need to do anything to keep them. Again, you can get hold of, you can find the trail to the government guidance through the Brexit toolkit and the checklist. Next slide, please. Intellectual property, IP, common or garden intellectual property. So if you have trademarks, copyrights, patents, or any other intellectual property rights registered with the EU Intellectual Property Office, then these should, I say should, maybe I should have underlined should have been translated into UK rights automatically. However, so that at least it should be straightforward. However, we recommend that you check with the UK Intellectual Property Office that this has actually happened, that it's actually been done. Don't just assume it's been done, because you could come unstuck. Do check on that to make sure it's been done, and if it hasn't, then I suppose you're going to have to shout at some people to get it done. You have 9 months from the end of the transitional period to register in the UK any trademark applications pending in the EU but not registered. So if they're pending but not registered, you've got 9 months to register in the UK. And for any IP rights created after the end of the transitional period, you'll need to, unfortunately, just take specific advice on how to protect them across the EU, which may well differ between the different legal jurisdictions in the EU. So you'll have to get onto a specialist intellectual property lawyer to find out how you protect them. So moving on to the final section and the next slide, travelling to and from the EU. The background is, and it does seem slightly peculiar giving this advice today when nobody's doing any travelling to and from the EU from the UK, but I'm sure that's going to last. Not going to last. I'm sure it'll get resolved fairly shortly. Freedom of movement is coming to an end. Well, I suppose today it has ended, in a sense. It's coming to an end, though, more seriously, legally speaking, on the 31st December 2020, and business travel will change after that date. It will change. No more just jumping on the Eurostar and going to your business meeting or whatever. It's going to change very drastically. The UK has made changes to its immigration rules, and these will start on the 31st December, and it will affect travel to and from the EU, as well as living and working. So not just living and working, but actual travel. So even if all your employees are UK based, or have they got settled status, whatever, even if all your office or your offices are all in the UK and you don't have one in the EU, if you're going out there traveling, if for any business reason at all, whether it's to do some contract work, even for a day, if you're not staying overnight, if it's going to a conference, it's going to a meeting, whatever it might be, certainly if it's working there permanently or for any period of time, any of these things, any work at all, will be affected. And it will affect both EU nationals and other non-UK nationals. But this guide is only relevant to EU nationals in the UK. I don't have the time or, unfortunately, the space here to deal with non-EU, to non-EU nationals in the UK from outside the UK and the EU. But the new rules on immigration will apply whether there is a deal or not. So that is another of the things that is going to happen regardless and irrespective of the deal. And similar, as I've mentioned, the rules on immigration will change both in terms of working permanently or just doing the odd business trip. So if I can have the next slide. Travelling to and from the EU, part one of the checklist. Businesses must make sure anyone travelling to work in EU member states or conversely coming from the EU to visit you here for meetings or contract work has the correct visa or visas and any other travel documents. So that is the really crucial first change from not needing to bother about it. You very much will need to bother about it and sort it out. The UK and the EU have said, however, having said all that, they will give visa exemptions for short-term tourism stays and business visits. Now they've said that, and in practice, it is likely to mean or may mean that there will be visa-free travel for business and leisure purposes, and that might be 90 days in any 180-day period. But, and it's a big but, paid activities will be restricted. Now, if we pause there, they have said that will probably happen. They will give those exemptions, but we don't know for certain. And what you also don't know is if what you're going to do will necessarily fall under that exemption. Don't assume that it will automatically be exempt because you're doing it for 89 days or after 90 or something like that. You must satisfy yourself and check beforehand that it isn't, that you don't need to have that visa in place for you or your employee, or indeed the person coming to visit you. So what could that mean? What restriction could there be? Well, local employment laws could apply. It might be illegal for people outside of, I don't know, say France to go and work in that particular sector in France. There might be without particular qualifications or a certificate or whatever. One of the things that came up quite recently in the legal sector was that lots of UK lawyers bought themselves onto the Republic of Ireland's role of solicitors. They bought themselves certificates so they could say they were a lawyer in the Republic of Ireland, and the Law Society of the Republic of Ireland made a nice tidy sum. I'm sure they would be having a big Christmas party at some point to celebrate that. They made themselves a nice tidy amount of money, and lo and behold, a couple of weeks after the solicitors in this country had bought those certificates. I don't imagine I wasn't one of them. I don't imagine I'd get a huge amount of sympathy for this. They were trying to circumvent the rules in the way that people and especially lawyers do to make themselves EU lawyers as well by having the certificate. Lo and behold, the Law Society of Ireland announced unilaterally a couple of weeks ago, without telling anybody, without telling the Law Society of England and Wales, that if you've got one of those certificates, that's great, but you won't actually get a practicing certificate, which is the really important thing, if you don't have an office in the Republic of Ireland. So unless you've got that office, and most of the people who bought those didn't, clearly, then your certificate is essentially worthless, although maybe it looks nice on the wall. So you have to, what you really need was a certificate to practice, to work. And that's one situation that I know about where those restrictions apply, so that if I had bought myself one of those certificates, which I happen to not to have done, but there we go, if I had one, and I turned up in Ireland to a bit of legal work, the first thing that I'd be asked is, well, where's your practicing certificate? Where's your office? You haven't got one. You're working legally. I'll probably get slapped with a fine and all the rest of it. So that's an example of the kind of thing that you're going to have to worry about and to watch out for. So you might need a work permit. You might need there might be requirements like that one on professional qualifications, and you can't assume that your qualifications and licenses will automatically be recognised in the country you're visiting. How do you find out if they are or not? Well, the first thing you can do is look at the checklist. You will find out, it will give you links to the different EU jurisdictions and different countries and how they do things, and you'll have to do a bit of delving about, I'm afraid, but you will be able to find there, with a bit of digging, a bit of researching, if you can carry out activity A in country B. So moving on to the next slide, checklist part 2. The real crucial things to take from this section: do not assume you will automatically be entitled to visa-free travel. Before going to the EU, check any of the countries in the EU, check how many days the visit will last and whether there are any regulations you have to follow. If you or your staff visit an EU country, then the local employment and the immigration laws will apply, and that might include having to pay tax or whatever it might be. If you open an office in the EU, that's one way. I mentioned a minute ago the lawyers who come unstuck in the UK, who come unstuck by getting on the roll as solicitors in Ireland, but not having an office that wasn't good enough. Maybe you would then think, well, all right, I've got a certificate, I'll get an office now as well. Some EU countries do impose conditions on investors and owners from outside the EU, so you might not automatically be able to open that office. There might be conditions on it. And while we're on subject, check the UK and EU guidance on travel, including passport requirements, roaming, insurance, driving licenses or permits, and so on, which again, you can find the links to all that in the Brexit Toolkit, which is available from the GLA, and if not, you can't get a hold of them or whatever, it's available from me. That brings me to the end of this recording. This is take 2, if you like. If you've got any questions, final slide, do get in contact with myself or the London Business Hub, who no doubt put you in contact with me, and I'd be delighted to talk to you about it and see what we can do, so we can point you in the right direction. I can also put you in the direction of any of the handouts that you may need if you're not able to get hold of them and the information. And all that remains for me to say is that I wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and stay safe.